The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Laura Bennett walks the third-floor corridor of Oak Creek Memorial at 11:48 p.m., her ID badge catching the harsh white glow, RN, trauma unit, nothing more. She takes the stairs instead of the elevator. Always the stairs. Fewer people in stairwells. Fewer conversations. Fewer eyes. Her hands tremble as she pushes through the heavy door marked Emergency Department, staff only. Not from fear. From 20 years of holding it together. She doesn't know that Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Chief of Surgery, will arrive in exactly 8 minutes. She doesn't know that Captain Jake Morrison's ambulance is already en route from the accident scene in northeast Portland, traveling at 63 miles per hour with 2 paramedics who are running out of time. She doesn't know that tonight will collapse everything she's spent 2 decades building. Laura punches her time card at 11:52 p.m. The timestamp glows on the digital display like a countdown no one's watching. She moves to the break room, a small space that smells of burnt coffee and something chemical, antiseptic underneath, always. The industrial coffee maker gurgles its nightly ritual. She pours lukewarm black liquid into a chipped mug that says "World's Best Mom" in faded letters. The irony of that mug has never escaped her. She's a mother of one, a boy named Derek who's 16 now and thinks his mother pushes medications and fills charts for a living. He doesn't ask many questions. She's trained him not to. Laura sits at the long formica table, alone as always. Within 30 seconds, 2 nurses from the day shift gathering their belongings exchange a glance, quick, practiced, silent, and leave. They don't greet her. They never do. She pretends not to notice. Her hands around the mug are steady now. Controlled. She's learned that composure is its own kind of armor. She reaches inside her scrub jacket, fingers finding the edge of something worn, something that shouldn't exist in this civilian hospital where no one asks about your past. The faded unit patch is barely larger than a postage stamp, sewn deep into the lining where only she knows to look. The emblem is almost completely faded, you have to know what you're looking for. She touches it for exactly 2 seconds. A ritual. A reminder. A warning. Then she removes her hand, finishes the coffee in 3 swallows, and stands to move back into the ER. The department is moving with the controlled chaos of a night shift, 3 patients in beds, 1 in observation. The waiting room has maybe 6 people with minor injuries or anxiety about minor injuries. The triage nurse, Melissa, nods at Laura without making eye contact. That's the agreement they've all reached. Laura works quietly. Laura doesn't make trouble. Laura is the kind of night shift nurse that hospitals prefer, competent, invisible, and asking nothing from anyone. Laura takes her position at the main station, pulling up the chart for bed 4, a 62-year-old male with chest pain that's probably indigestion. She checks his vitals with the methodical precision of someone who's been doing this for longer than anyone here has been alive. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate regular. O2 sat at 97. Her hands move with absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from a body that remembers what the brain has tried to forget. She's making a note in the chart when the ER doors crash open at 12:04 a.m. Not the gentle whoosh of an automatic door. The violent slam of metal hitting stops. The sound echoes through the department like a starting bell. Incoming trauma, the radio crackles. ETA 2 minutes. GSW and shrapnel wounds, septic shock, temperature 104.8, BP 88/54 and dropping. Patient is military, presumed combat veteran. Multiple lacerations, possible abdominal penetration. The ER shifts. That smooth, practice machinery that knows how to move when death walks through the doors. Trauma bays 1 and 2 are prepped. Equipment is pulled. A resident appears from somewhere, Dr. Chen, young, the kind of young that makes Laura feel the weight of her own years in a way that nothing else can. The ambulance arrives with the kind of controlled urgency that means they've done this 100 times. The paramedic riding in the back is a man named Rodriguez, early 40s, with hands that have held more dying people than he'll ever talk about. He rattles off vitals in the clipped language of people who don't have time for full sentences. Captain Jake Morrison, Army Ranger, shrapnel and gunshot wounds from patrol, fever spiking for 6 hours, started septic shock en route, we've got 2 4s running normal saline wide open, 1 unit of PRBCs on board, getting worse not better. They're moving him toward Trauma Bay 1, the stretcher wheels squeaking against linoleum like something dying. Laura is at her station, watching. She's always watching. Watching is what she does. Watching is what she's trained to do. Her hands hold the edge of the desk with the grip of someone who's about to hear something that will change everything, and she doesn't even know it yet. The patient comes into view. For a moment, time doesn't stop. Time never actually stops. Time just becomes something else. It becomes a tunnel. Everything outside that tunnel ceases to exist, and inside the tunnel there is only this, a tall man, mid-30s, decorated Army Ranger uniform hanging in shreds from a body that's burning up from inside, and eyes, green as the Afghanistan sky when the dust clears and you can see clear to the horizon. Laura's pen falls. It doesn't drop. It falls. It hits the desk with a sound like a gunshot. She knows those eyes. She pulled those eyes, when they belonged to an 8-year-old boy named Jacob Morrison, from underneath a collapsed wall in Kandahar province 21 years ago. She sang to him while his mother lay dead beside him. She held his shattered leg and told him his mother was waiting for him on the other side. She lied to a dying child because that's what you do, and she spent every single night since wondering if he lived, if he survived, if that little boy with the green eyes that looked like someone's future growing up in a hospital somewhere with a normal mother who wasn't destroyed by what she'd seen. He lived. He became a soldier. And he's dying in Trauma Bay 1. Laura stands without deciding to stand. Her body moves on its own. Muscle memory. 19 years of active duty, 2 decades of civilian nursing, her nervous system knows what to do even when her mind is imploding in absolute silence. She's in Trauma Bay 1 before anyone notices she's moved. Dr. Chen looks up, surprised to see her. The trauma team is assembling. Someone's calling for orthopedic, someone else is calling for general surgery, and someone somewhere in the hospital is paging Dr. Hargrove because when a young military patient comes in with this kind of wound pattern, the attending surgeons wake up and start making decisions that will either save or destroy a life. Laura checks Morrison's vitals herself. Her hands are steady. Not because she's composed. Because her hands have been steady through worse. 72 casualties in a single day. A helicopter crash. A field hospital taking direct fire. Her hands have been steady through the worst things that human bodies can suffer, and they're steady now, reading Morrison's pulse like it's a message in a language she's never forgotten. Heart rate 142. Tachycardic. Fever is burning him from the inside out. The shrapnel wounds are already showing early signs of necrotizing fasciitis, the flesh around the wounds is darkening, the skin is moving wrong, inflation beneath the surface where gas is being produced by bacteria that are eating him alive from inside. He needs surgery. Now. Not in 30 minutes. Now. His green eyes move to her face. For a moment, just one moment, he focuses on her. Through the fever, through the pain, through the septic shock that's dragging him down toward unconsciousness, he focuses on her. You, he says. His voice is barely audible. You. I know you. You sang. You sang in Kandahar. You were. His eyes close. His body goes rigid. The heart monitor accelerates. His breathing becomes shallow, panicked, the breathing of a man whose body is beginning to shut down. Laura's hand is on his shoulder. Professional. Clinical. Her voice is steady when she speaks, and when she speaks, she doesn't sound like a night shift ER nurse anymore. She sounds like someone who's given orders in languages that shook mountains. I'm here, she says. You're safe. You're at Oak Creek Memorial. You're with medical. I'm not leaving you. It's not a request. It's a statement of fact. Dr. Chen is staring at her. The trauma team is staring at her. No one has ever heard Laura Bennett speak like that. Like she owns the room. Like she owns the moment. Like she owns this patient's life and is refusing to let anyone else touch it. But Laura isn't thinking about what anyone hears. She's thinking about a boy in Kandahar who was 8 years old and terrified and alone in darkness under a collapsed wall, and she's thinking about the promise she made him, conscious or unconscious, whether he remembered it or not, that if she could help it, she would be there. The ER doors open again. Dr. Hargrove arrives for his 7:30 a.m. round 3 hours early, tablet in hand, expensive shoes clicking on tile with the rhythm of a man who's never questioned his right to be anywhere he needs to be. He takes one look at the chaos in Trauma Bay 1. One look at Laura standing over Morrison like she's made of something stronger than human. One look at the respect in Dr. Chen's posture, at the way the trauma team is moving with absolute purpose instead of scattered panic. And his expression changes. Just slightly. Just enough that Laura, who's been reading people's faces for 21 years, can see it. He's realized something. He hasn't realized what yet. But he's realized that something in his ER is not what he thinks it is. Dr. Hargrove stood in the charting station at 2 in the morning, Morrison's file open under the fluorescent lights. His jaw tightened as he scrolled through the vitals. Septic shock. Multi-organ involvement. Extended ICU trajectory. He did the math the way he always did, not in terms of a human life, but in terms of hospital metrics. Mortality rate impact. Length of stay cost per bed. The damage to Oak Creek Memorial's performance standing with the state board. His fingers drummed against the desk, each tap a small calculation. A ranger with complications was a liability with a heartbeat. He found Laura at Morrison's bedside 40 minutes later, where she stood checking the lines with the kind of focused precision that made Hargrove's instincts flare. She moved like someone who'd done this before. Not like a night shift nurse. Like someone with muscle memory carved into her bones. He pushed the thought away and cleared his throat. Family consultation in 5, Hargrove said. Not a request. A notification delivered with the weight of command. Laura nodded without turning. His wife is in the waiting area. His cardiac pressures are rising. I'm aware of the chart, Nurse Bennett. The way she turned then, slow, deliberate, made something in Hargrove's chest tighten. But he was chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial. He'd navigated hospital politics for 19 years, built alliances with board members, maintained the delicate balance between patient care and institutional survival. One night shift nurse with steady hands wasn't going to change his trajectory. Emily Morrison sat rigidly in the consultation room when they entered. She was 47, Hargrove's research told him, with the kind of trembling hands that came from watching your husband deteriorate in real time. Captain Jake Morrison lay 3 floors below, machines breathing for him. She didn't know yet that those machines were expensive. That extended ICU stays affected departmental budgets. That a transfer to county care would solve several problems at once. Laura entered last, positioning herself by the monitor mounted on the wall. Not at the table. Not beside Emily. Observing. Mrs. Morrison, Hargrove began, his voice calibrated to warmth and concern. Your husband's condition has stabilized, but we're seeing signs of systemic infection that will require specialized care. County General has an excellent infectious disease team. I think transfer would be the most appropriate. His cardiac pressures are rising, Laura said quietly. Muffled heart sounds on exam. He needs pericardiocentesis within the hour or... Nurse Bennett, Hargrove cut her off, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for insubordination. When exactly did you complete your medical degree? The room froze. Emily's hand went white-knuckled on the armrest. I apologize for my nurse's limited clinical judgment, Mrs. Morrison. Hargrove turned to Emily with practiced sympathy, the kind he'd refined over 2 decades of difficult conversations. She has a tendency to play hero with patients above her pay grade. It's a pattern we're addressing in her performance review. County General will provide excellent care, I assure you. Laura took one measured breath. Then another. Her jaw clenched once, sharp as a struck match. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, not from shame, but from the kind of restraint that comes from having survived worse things than public humiliation. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. "Captain Morrison will code during transfer," she said, her voice flat as a scout's report. "His pericardium is filling with fluid. His heart can't generate adequate pressure." "That's not heroism, Doctor. That's assessment." Hargrove's face flushed crimson. His hand closed into a fist against his thigh. But he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Noted, Florence. We'll handle his care from here." He stood, extending his hand to Emily. "Your husband is in good hands." Emily didn't take it. She was staring at Laura, then at Hargrove, trying to read which one was telling the truth. Laura held her gaze for 2 seconds, long enough to communicate something without words. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her limp more pronounced than usual, her shoulders carrying the weight of something far heavier than a single shift. The break room at 3:15 was where the real reckoning happened. Laura filled her coffee mug, black, no sugar, the way you drink it when you need clarity not comfort, and turned to find 4 nurses sitting at the corner table. Chen. Rodriguez. Walsh. Michaels. All night shift. All people she'd worked alongside for 18 months without incident. The conversation stopped the moment she appeared. It wasn't a dramatic halt. It was the kind of sudden silence that happens in predator presence. Slow and absolute. One by one, they gathered their lunches. Chen took her salad container. Rodriguez her yogurt. Walsh and Michaels their phones. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't acknowledge her. They simply created a vacuum where Laura stood and moved, together, to a different table. To the far side of the break room where they could resume their conversation in tones that were just loud enough to reach her. She actually contradicted Hargrove. In front of the patient's wife. "Career suicide. I'm not getting near that one." Laura sat in the space they'd abandoned and ate her sandwich mechanically. The turkey was dry. The bread was yesterday's. She chewed and swallowed and didn't taste any of it. Her hand drifted to the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she'd kept hidden for 20 years. The weight of it against her ribs felt like an anchor or maybe a life raft. She couldn't decide which. By 4 in the morning, the formal write-up was posted on the unit board in the hallway where every staff member would see it. Hargrove's handwriting was precise, his language surgical. Disciplinary action, Laura Bennett, RN, insubordination and boundary violations during family consultation. Demonstrates pattern of overstepping clinical authority. Failure to maintain appropriate professional boundaries with patient family members. Final warning before formal termination review. The consequences were typed underneath in bold, suspension pending administrative hearing. A cluster of nurses gathered to read it when the shift change began. Laura walked past without stopping, but she heard the whispers like a sonar array detecting her position. "That's the one who argued with Hargrove." "Yeah. Florence thinks she's a doctor. I heard she has some kind of psych flag in her file." Laura's jaw tightened. Her hand touched the patch again, muscle memory, a talisman, a reminder of something she'd buried so deep it was supposed to stay dead. Then she let her hand fall away. She had 2 hours left on her shift. Morrison was still in the ER. The transfer team was being arranged. Hargrove had already made his calls. She returned to Morrison's room at 4:30. Emily had fallen asleep in the visitor's chair, her head tilted at an angle that would leave her neck stiff by morning. Morrison lay unconscious, his chest rising and falling with the ventilator's rhythm. The monitors showed what Laura's exam had already told her: cardiac tamponade developing. Fluid around the heart. Pressure building. Time contracting like a closing fist. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, beep, 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 a metronome counting down toward something none of them could stop. Laura checked the pericardial fluid levels one more time. The numbers confirmed what she already knew. 1 hour remained. Maybe 90 minutes if Morrison was lucky. The transfer would take 40 minutes minimum. The county ER would need another 30 to set up for drainage. He wouldn't survive the trip. She touched Morrison's forehead, just once. His skin was warm. His breathing was steady. He was still 8 years old in her memory, those green eyes looking up from the rubble in Kandahar, asking wordlessly if someone was coming. Someone had come. She had come. She'd sung to keep him conscious while they pulled him free. Emily stirred in her sleep, her hand reaching instinctively toward her husband's hand. Laura moved toward the door. She had 3 hours remaining on her shift and a suspension letter that would be official the moment the sun rose. She had a patient who was dying of a reversible condition and a chief of surgery who decided that patient's life was less valuable than hospital metrics. She had a faded patch inside her jacket that represented a woman she'd killed, not physically, but completely, by choosing anonymity over anything else. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency, a sound like electricity burning through copper wire. Laura walked toward the supply closet, her limp more pronounced now, her shoulders bent like someone carrying invisible weight. She didn't know yet that the next 4 hours would change everything. Hour 3 came like a whisper that turned into a scream. Laura pushed through Morrison's door at 11:48 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that still held the day's stains, antiseptic and sweat and the copper tang of fear. The monitors told her everything. The cardiac rhythm was climbing, racing like a predator sensing weakness. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation drifting down from what it should have been. But it was the central venous pressure reading that made her spine straighten. The number kept climbing, climbing, climbing. Fluid around his heart. Tamponade. The kind of medical physics that didn't care about hierarchy or credentials or which doctor had the bigger title. Fluid compressed the myocardium, the heart couldn't fill, and in maybe 40 minutes Morrison would go into arrest and nobody would be able to save him because his heart was being suffocated from the outside in. Emily sat in the chair beside Morrison's bed, her hand threaded through his like they were still on their wedding day, not in a hospital where the machines beat their countdown. She was crying without sound, the kind of silent weeping that meant she'd already run through rage and bargaining and landed somewhere past hope. Emily. Laura's voice was flat. Statement, not question. Look at me. Emily's eyes came up. Red. Swollen. The eyes of a woman watching her husband die in increments. His tamponade's progressing. The fluid around his heart is compressing it. Laura moved to the bedside, her movements economical, wasting nothing. He needs a pericardiocentesis. Fast. Or we lose him. The monitor beeped. O2 sat dropping again. 87, 84. 81. Who's going to do it? Emily's voice cracked like old glass. That was when Laura walked to the door and looked down the hallway. The code team was assembled 30 feet away, just past the nursing station. She counted them, the lead attending from cardiac surgery, 2 residents, the respiratory therapist with the crash cart already positioned, nurses standing by with medications ready to push. They had the equipment. They had the training. They had the institutional weight of Oak Creek Memorial behind them. And every single one of them was standing motionless, watching the hallway like soldiers waiting for orders that never came. The attending physician, a man named Richardson whose nameplate read 15 years of residency, met Laura's eyes across that 30-foot gulf of tile and fluorescent white light. His jaw was tight. He knew what the monitors said. He knew what Morrison needed. And he shook his head once, a small lateral movement, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But Laura was always watching. That headshake meant career suicide. That headshake meant Hargrove had made the calls. That headshake meant mortgages and student loan payments and partner track reviews and letters of recommendation for the next job were all contingent on walking away from a dying man. Richardson's eyes held something that might have been apology or might have been fear, probably both. He turned away, gestured to his team. They didn't move the crash cart closer. They didn't advance. They simply stood there, trained professionals forced into the posture of bystanders. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Laura had been in Marja when the forward operating base took in direct fire and all the senior medics got pulled to the main trauma center, and she was the only trauma-qualified person standing in a rubble field with 72 civilians who'd just been caught in the secondary explosion. She'd learned that day that institutions don't save lives. People do. Titles don't save lives. Training does. And when the system breaks, you either become a ghost in the machine or you become something else entirely. She understood what was happening. Hargrove had weaponized the entire hospital against a single patient. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding that she had maybe 3 minutes before the transfer team arrived to wheel Morrison to county care, to a facility that wouldn't have the surgical capacity, wouldn't have the attending surgeons, wouldn't have anything but a delayed death certificate and a family plot with fresh grave dirt. Laura walked back into the room. Her limp was more pronounced now, the left leg compensating for something deep in the hip that medical imaging had never quite explained. She moved to Emily's chair and leaned down until her eyes were level with the other woman's. "I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes, Laura said quietly. "Can you do that?" Emily was staring at the monitors. At the climbing numbers. At the visual representation of her husband's heart being slowly crushed. "What are you going to do?" Emily whispered. "Something I learned in Marja," Laura said. Emily's head came up sharply. Marja was a name that only soldiers knew. Only people who'd been there understood why you didn't speak it casually. It was a place where ordinary people did extraordinary things or died trying, and there was no middle ground. "I need you to create a distraction," Laura continued. "The transfer team arrives in 5 minutes. I need 3 minutes alone with your husband." Emily stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her chin had set into a line that suggested she came from military stock herself. "What do I do?" "Go into the hallway. Find the nearest desk. Make noise about billing. Insurance. The transfer authorization. Find the administrator on call. Make them explain why county care is appropriate for a ranger." Laura's voice dropped lower. "Make them have to explain medical decisions instead of just executing them." Emily nodded once and moved out the door. 30 seconds later, her voice came from somewhere near the front desk, not frantic, not hysterical, but the controlled fury of a woman who'd just discovered her rights and decided to exercise them. The sound of papers being demanded. A supervisor being paged. A woman asking to speak with whoever authorized this transfer because she wanted it in writing that Oak Creek Memorial was deliberately denying her husband appropriate surgical care. Laura released the bed brakes. She moved fast but without rushing, the way you moved in trauma situations when speed had to be married to precision or everything fell apart. Morrison was semi-conscious, drifting in and out, the sepsis and infection and blood loss combining into a chemical fog that was its own kind of mercy. She wheeled the gurney out through the back corridor, the one that connected to supply and pharmacy, the one that most floor nurses didn't know existed because they'd never had to evacuate a patient on their own. Her left leg burned as she moved, but pain was information. Pain meant she was still functional. The supply closet was small, windowless, climate-controlled to keep medication stable. She got the gurney through the door and locked it behind her. For a moment she was standing in that small space with a dying man and inventory on metal shelves and fluorescent lights that made everything look like it was underwater. She could hear Hargrove's voice from down the hallway now, distant and rising. "Where the hell is Morrison? Code Team 1, where is your patient?" Laura's hands moved on their own. She tore open the pericardiocentesis kit, 14-gauge needle, local anesthetic, the long catheter that would go where medication and training had prepared her. She identified the insertion point by memory and anatomy, the space between the 5th and 6th ribs, just below the left nipple where she could angle the needle toward the pericardial sac. Her hands were completely steady. This was muscle memory from field hospitals in Helmand Province, from working under fire when screaming was a luxury nobody could afford. She was prepping the insertion site when Morrison's eyes opened. He focused on her face for the first time with real clarity, his eyes still holding the green that she recognized from 20 years back, from the rubble of Kandahar when she'd sung to a terrified child while her team secured the perimeter. "You were there," Morrison whispered. His voice was barely a sound above the equipment beeping behind her. "Kandahar, you sang to me." Laura's hands didn't shake as she inserted the needle, angling it with a precision that only comes from muscle memory and purpose and the kind of training that becomes bone deep. "Amazing grace," she said quietly, the words coming from somewhere she'd locked away 20 years ago, from before she learned how to be invisible. "You remembered." "Never forgot," Morrison breathed. His eyes were closing again, slipping back into the fog. "Saved my life, then, and now, saved." The needle was in position. Laura drew back on the syringe and felt the resistance give way. The fluid came, straw-colored, thick, the physical evidence of sepsis finding its way into spaces where it didn't belong. She drew slowly, methodically, watching as the pressure in his heart released with each milliliter that she pulled out. The monitor showed it immediately. The pressure readings dropping. The oxygen saturation climbing again. 87, 89. 91, 94. Sinus rhythm reasserting itself. She was removing the needle, applying direct pressure with sterile gauze, when the fists hit the supply closet door. "Open this door now." Hargrove's voice came through like he was screaming from behind reinforced glass. "You have 5 seconds before I have security remove you from this hospital." Laura finished the dressing. Applied the tape. Checked Morrison's eyes one more time to confirm the lucidity was returning, the color in his face improving as his heart was freed from the fluid that had been suffocating it. She opened the door. Hargrove was standing there with 2 security officers, his face white, his eyes locked on the supply closet interior where Morrison lay breathing deeper, his oxygen saturation holding at 94% and climbing. Laura could see Hargrove's mind working in real time, calculating what had just happened, what it meant, what this nurse had just done without authorization, without supervision, without the institutional frameworks he'd so carefully constructed. "You just performed a surgical procedure without a physician order," Hargrove said quietly. His voice had dropped from rage into something colder and much more dangerous. "You're fired. Effective immediately. These officers will escort you from this facility. If you ever set foot in a hospital again, I'll file charges for practicing medicine without a license." The 2 guards took her arms. Their grips were professional, not rough, but final. There was no negotiating with this kind of institutional power. There was only the walk out. As they escorted her past Morrison's room, Emily was standing in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. She didn't speak. She didn't say thank you. She just placed her hand on her chest and held Laura's eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to communicate everything that couldn't be said in a hallway full of people who'd already decided what they believed. Laura moved toward the exit, toward the rain that was hammering the parking lot like applause for something nobody had been allowed to cheer for. The security officers held the doors open. Professional. By the book. Following the orders of the chief of surgery who had spent 6 hours dismantling a nurse's career to protect his own institutional position and liability exposure. The last thing Laura heard before the doors closed behind her was Morrison's wife screaming for a doctor, screaming that her husband was breathing better, screaming that something had changed, something had shifted, and everyone was going to have to answer for what they'd chosen not to do. The supply closet was 6 feet by 8 feet, barely wide enough for the gurney. Laura had wheeled Morrison through the back corridor at 11:36 p.m., past the radiology suite, past the break room where the night shift nurses pretended not to see her, past the storage racks of saline bags and chest tubes. Security was 2 floors below, escorting empty hallways. Hargrove was on the phone in his office, calling his network, activating his connections. He had no idea what was about to happen in the dark. Morrison's breathing had turned wet. Gasping. The kind of sound that meant fluid was compressing his heart with every beat. Cardiac tamponade doesn't announce itself. It whispers, then it kills. Laura's hands moved on their own, 14 years of combat medical training surfacing like muscle memory rising from underwater. She'd done this before in Kandahar with a corpsman's kit and a prayer. She could do it with what she had now. The supply closet had one overhead light. She turned it off and used her phone's flashlight, angled against the wall. Sterile field. She didn't have a sterile field. She had a supply closet, and 6 minutes before Morrison's blood pressure bottomed out completely. The ultrasound machine was back in the ER, guarded by protocols and physicians who'd already abandoned him. She worked without it. 2-inch needle. 14-gauge angiocath. She palpated Morrison's chest wall, fourth intercostal space, midclavicular line, and felt the landmarks beneath her fingertips like reading Braille in the dark. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was what 20 years of controlled breathing brought you, hands that didn't betray you when everything else was collapsing. She pushed the needle through skin. Through fascia. Through the pericardial membrane. The hiss of air escaping. Fluid under pressure. 200 milliliters of blood that had been slowly choking his heart, draining out through the needle, into the syringe, dark and thick as motor oil. Morrison's breathing shifted. Changed. Deepened. "You were there," he whispered, his eyes suddenly lucid. "Kandahar. You sang to me." Laura didn't pause. Her hands kept moving. "Breathe. Captain. Don't talk. You pulled me out. From under the rubble. You sang something. I've heard it in my dreams for 20 years. Your voice. I never knew your name. I never knew if you were real or if I imagined you to survive." The fluid kept draining. 60 milliliters. 100. 140. His oxygen saturation climbed. 82%. 87. 91. The compression releasing. The heart finding room to beat again. It was the Navy hymn, Laura said quietly. She applied gentle pressure around the needle. "Eternal Father, strong to save. I sang it to keep you calm. To keep you conscious. I knew it," Morrison breathed. "I've known it my whole life, but I didn't know where it came from. It came from you." 210 milliliters. His breathing steady now. His color beginning to shift from gray to something approaching human. His heart rate dropping from 142 to 108. From desperate to survivable in the space of 90 seconds. The supply closet door slammed open. Security. 2 of them. And behind them, emerging from the shadows of the hallway, Dr. Hargrove's assistant, clipboard in hand, with the official paperwork for Morrison's transfer to county care. The crisis management protocol activated at 11:52 p.m., 13 minutes after Laura had locked herself in a supply closet and committed the one act that would end her career completely. "Step away from the patient," the first security officer said. Laura withdrew the needle and applied direct pressure to the catheter site. Her voice when she spoke was ice. "Captain Morrison is stable. His cardiac tamponade has been decompressed. He needs monitoring, but his breathing. You're not authorized to perform procedures," the security officer said. He was young, maybe 25, and he looked genuinely confused. "You're a nurse. You don't do that." "I just did." Laura taped the catheter in place with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Get him back to the cardiac unit. Continuous monitoring. If his JVD returns, if his blood pressure drops again, you call me immediately, Anne." "You're being escorted from the building," the officer said. "Right now." "Those are my orders." Laura's hands went still. She looked at Morrison. His eyes were open. Clear. Aware. He reached for her hand and she let him take it, one moment, his grip surprisingly strong for a man who'd been dying 30 seconds earlier. "Thank you," he said. "For singing." "For both times." They walked her out past the nurse's station. The night shift staff turned away. Past the ER doors where Morrison's wife stood in the waiting room, her face crumpling as she watched them take the nurse away, the nurse who'd kept her husband breathing. Past the administrative offices where Dr. Hargrove watched through the glass with an expression somewhere between triumph and concern that people might ask questions he couldn't answer, triumph that he'd solved his liability problem by removing the one person who could prove he'd been wrong. The parking lot was raining. Late August rain in Portland, warm and heavy, the kind that felt like the city was sweating. Laura's car was a 2008 Honda Civic with 73,000 miles on it. She sat in the driver's seat for 30 minutes with the engine off, rain drumming the roof, and didn't cry. She'd been trained not to cry. She'd been trained to compartmentalize, to store emotion in boxes labeled for later, to keep functioning when everything around her was breaking. At 8:24 p.m. that evening, she sat in the waiting room at the VA hospital downtown. Her intake appointment. Her admission into the mental health services she'd been avoiding for 6 years. The room smelled like old coffee and floor wax. Around her sat the men and women she used to treat as Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Navy combat medic, before the nightmares became too loud and she'd walked away from everything. A Marine with a prosthetic left leg, obviously recent, the way he still moved like he was favoring the phantom limb. A 75th Ranger Regiment patch on his duffel bag. She'd treated Rangers like him in Kandahar, seen them come in shredded and terrified and somehow still cracking jokes. An older Army vet, mid-60s, grey at the temples, with a service dog that wore the vest of a psychiatric alert animal. His bearing said officer once. His trembling hand said PTSD now, the kind that came from too many years in positions where people died when you made mistakes. A younger woman, maybe 30, nursing a coffee and wearing a faded Special Operations Command patch on her jacket. Eyes that had seen things that shouldn't be seen by people that young. Laura recognized them because she was them. She'd walked into combat with those same eyes. She'd come home with the same weight in her chest. She'd spent 20 years pretending it wasn't there. The intake coordinator called her name. Laura Bennett. She stood. Her limp was pronounced today. The old injury, the one from Helmand Province, always came back when she was exhausted. She'd been told it was psychosomatic, that her body created pain when her mind was desperate to leave. Maybe they were right. Maybe the pain was just her body's way of screaming what her voice had never allowed. As she walked toward the coordinator's office, she passed a mirror. The face looking back at her was 47 years old with grey at the temples and scars she'd stopped counting. Not Senior Chief Bennett anymore, that uniform had been donated to a consignment shop 15 years ago. Not Nurse Bennett either, she'd been fired 3 hours ago for saving a life that Dr. Hargrove had decided to let die. She had nothing left. No rank. No job. No identity that fit anymore. Just a faded unit patch sewn inside a jacket lining, hidden even from the people she'd lived with for 20 years. Hidden from her ex-husband. Hidden from her 16-year-old son Derek, who'd been 2 years old when she walked away from the Navy and never explained why. The coordinator smiled at her. "Come on back, Laura. Let's start with what brought you in tonight." Laura sat in the intake office and said nothing for a very long time. Behind her, in the waiting room, the other veterans waited for their own appointments. The Marine. The officer. The young woman with the SOCOM patch. They all had the same look Laura had worn for 20 years, the look of people trying desperately to be invisible. She'd hidden her past because after her final deployment, the nightmares became unbearable. She'd hidden it from everyone. She'd hidden it from herself. Now there was nowhere left to hide. The administrator's office at Oak Creek Memorial was built for intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Portland's skyline. A conference table that could seat 20. But this morning, it held only silence and the weight of what was about to happen. Laura sat alone on one side of the mahogany expanse. 3 hospital administrators faced her from the other, their expressions already written. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the table, his body language suggesting he'd already won, shoulders back, fingers steepled, the posture of a man certain of his institutional power. Senior Chief Bennett, the administrator began, opening a folder. His name was David Chen. He'd been at Oak Creek for 8 years. Laura had never spoken to him. "You understand why we're here?" She said nothing. Composure. Measured breath. This was the part where she was supposed to cry or plead. She didn't. "The incident with Captain Morrison," Chen continued, "represents a serious breach of protocol. Dr. Hargrove has documented multiple violations of hospital hierarchy, insubordination, and what is characterized as psychological instability affecting clinical judgment." Hargrove nodded, satisfied. "I have 23 years of impeccable service at this institution." This nurse attempted to override physician judgment based on her own assessment. That's not nursing. That's delusion. The office door exploded open. Derek burst through like a small hurricane, his face red, his 16-year-old voice shaking with the kind of fury only a child defending a parent can summon. He was holding a shadow box made of dark mahogany, the glass catching the morning light. Inside it, medals caught fire, ribbons of gold and crimson, insignia that meant nothing to most people but everything to those who understood the weight they carried. "Mom, they need to see these," he shouted. "You can't let them do this." He slammed the shadow box on the conference table so hard one of the administrators flinched. The room froze. That wasn't a teenager's voice anymore. That was authority. That was the voice of someone who'd watched his mother sacrifice everything and wasn't about to watch her erase herself again. Chen stared at the shadow box. Hargrove's jaw tightened, the first crack in his certainty. A trauma nurse named Rebecca Vasquez, someone who'd worked 3 years at Oak Creek and never paid much attention to the quiet night shift nurse in the corner, picked up Laura's file with trembling hands. Her voice, when she spoke, had changed. The kind of voice people use when they're holding something sacred. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett," she read aloud, her eyes moving across the page. "Navy Cross recipient. 3 Purple Hearts. 3 words. That's all it took." Rebecca's hands shook as she turned the file toward the administrators. Hargrove stood up. "This is irrelevant. Whatever she did 20 years ago." The door opened again. This time, it wasn't a teenager. Commander Thomas Walsh entered in full Navy dress uniform, the kind that makes fluorescent lighting look dull. Behind him came a woman in an FBI windbreaker, her badge visible, her expression suggesting she'd seen worse than hospital politics and found them equally contemptible. Walsh moved to the table with the precision of someone accustomed to rooms parting before him. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of weathered face that comes from 20 years of watching sunrises over combat zones. His eyes found Laura's for exactly 1 second, and in that second, she saw recognition. Not of her face, he'd never seen her face before. Recognition of what she was. "I'm Commander Thomas Walsh, SEAL Team 3, he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, quiet, enormous, inevitable. "Captain Morrison served under my command in Marja. I'm here to provide context regarding Senior Chief Bennett's actions both then and now." He placed his hand on the file. When he spoke again, each word carried the weight of testimony. "Distinguished Service Medal," he said, "for extracting 12 wounded Marines from a collapsed field hospital under direct fire." The administrator's face had gone pale. "Bronze Star with Valor," Walsh continued, "for medical operations during the siege at Marja. And she stayed with my men for 6 hours when every other medic evacuated. 6 hours. Under fire. With nothing but her hand and her refusal to leave. Silence. The kind that happens when people suddenly realize they've been standing in front of something much larger than they understood. The FBI agent stepped forward. Her name was Agent Isabella Torres. She opened a tablet and the room's attention snapped to her like iron to a magnet. "Captain Morrison's unit has been tracking a war criminal for 2 decades, Torres said flatly. "He operates out of Southeast Asia. Coalition forces have been coordinating with Interpol for 19 years. The only person who can identify him is Captain Morrison, and the only person who can confirm that identification is Senior Chief Bennett." She turned the tablet toward Hargrove. In 2004, she pulled a child from rubble in Kandahar. That child was our target's nephew. She saved his life. She can place him in that location with a timestamp. That makes her the most valuable witness in a case that spans 20 countries. Hargrove's face had drained of all color. His hand went to his tie, tugging it as if suddenly his collar was too tight. Torres continued with the precision of someone reading evidence into a record. Senior Chief Bennett's presence at this hospital was flagged by our security coordination with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We've been monitoring Captain Morrison's recovery because the War Criminals Organization has been searching for leverage. Senior Chief Bennett is that leverage. The administrator turned to Hargrove. Doctor, you stated you contacted her previous employers. The Navy Cross isn't exactly hard to verify. What did you actually find? Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. There were gaps. Employment gaps. I made reasonable assumptions. You made defamatory statements without conducting basic verification, one of the board members snapped. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, and she looked like the kind of woman who'd served on enough boards to recognize a disaster unfolding in real time. Another man entered. Marcus Webb, the hospital's IT director, a Marine Corps veteran with the kind of build that suggested he still did things like pull-ups and running. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need to be. The tactical backpack he set on the table said everything. He placed a hard drive beside Hargrove's coffee cup. Dr. Hargrove requested that I delete security footage from yesterday's incident, Marcus said, his voice steady and military. Told me it was a liability issue. I'm former Marine intelligence. I know what covering up evidence looks like. Marcus opened his backpack and removed a laptop. Footage appeared on the conference table's large monitor. The ER bay. The code team. Morrison's wife in the consultation room. And Hargrove's hand on a physician's shoulder, followed by clear audio, transfer him to county. We're not equipped for complex cardiac interventions. It's a liability. The footage showed another physician nodding reluctantly. Then another, contacted by phone. Then security approaching the ER bay. Then it showed Laura moving Morrison's gurney. I saved every frame before reporting it to the State Medical Board, Marcus said quietly. The footage shows Dr. Hargrove ordering Morrison's transfer over medical objections, blocking the code team from responding to his cardiac arrest and making calls to prevent other physicians from intervening. It also shows Senior Chief Bennett performing a life-saving procedure after every authorized physician abandoned their patient. The screen showed the supply closet. The needle entering Morrison's chest. The fluid draining. The monitor. O2 sat climbing, 72. 78, 85. 91, the hiss of air escaping. Breathing restored. No one spoke. Hargrove's hands had begun to shake. You can't, I was protecting the hospital's interests. You were protecting your metrics, Sullivan said coldly. And you weaponized this institution's policies to punish a nurse who witnessed your malpractice. An outside investigator who'd been sitting quietly in the corner stood up. He'd been brought in to rubber-stamp whatever narrative Hargrove wanted. He wanted no part of what was happening now. He left the room without saying goodbye. Chen opened another file. His voice, when he spoke, had become something different, not administrative anymore, but judicial. Dr. Hargrove, your medical privileges at Oak Creek Memorial are suspended immediately pending a full investigation. You're placed on administrative leave. Security will escort you from the building. Hargrove stood so quickly his chair fell backward. I built this surgical program. I brought millions in revenue. You can't. We can, Chen said. And we will. You interfered with patient care and attempted to destroy evidence. You're done here. Security took Hargrove's arms. As they moved him toward the door, he stared at Laura with something that might have been hatred or might have been the look of someone watching his entire constructed reality collapse. She met his eyes without flinching, without saying a word. Her silence was louder than anything she could have spoken. Derek squeezed her shoulder. Commander Walsh nodded once, the kind of military acknowledgement that meant everything. Agent Torres closed her laptop with deliberate finality. The administrator turned to Laura. Senior Chief Bennett, on behalf of Oak Creek Memorial, I apologize. Your termination is rescinded. We'd like to offer you the position of night shift nursing supervisor, if you're willing to stay. Laura looked at Derek. At the shadow box of metal sitting on the conference table. At the faded unit patch that she slowly, finally, removed from inside her jacket lining. The fabric was worn, faded from 20 years of being hidden. The outline was barely visible now, but it was there. It had always been there. I need time, she said quietly. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential whisper anymore. It was the voice of someone who'd spent 6 hours in a supply closet making life-or-death decisions while the entire institution tried to stop her. 20 years of hiding doesn't disappear in one morning. Walsh nodded. He understood. The kind of understanding that comes from knowing exactly how long it takes to become someone new, and how much longer it takes to accept who you used to be. Take whatever time you need, Senior Chief, he said. That was the thing about the military. It never really let you go. Even after 20 years of silence, even after choosing anonymity and night shifts and eating alone in corners, even after the nightmares that had driven her away from everything she'd been, the moment someone said her rank with that tone, something shifted inside her. Something that had been locked away in the same place as the faded patch. Derek was grinning at her like he'd just watched his mother stand up from the ashes. She thought about the VA hospital waiting room from last night. The intake appointment she'd scheduled. The doctor she was supposed to see today. The psych evaluation and the PTSD assessment and the slow process of rebuilding something that had never really broken, just hidden. Maybe she wouldn't need that appointment. Or maybe she would. Maybe both things could be true. Rebecca, the trauma nurse, was staring at Laura like she was seeing her for the first time. You really pulled 12 people out of a collapsed building, she whispered. 19, Commander Walsh corrected gently. 12 Marines from the field hospital. 7 civilians. She went back in after she was ordered to evacuate. Laura said nothing. The shadow box sat on the table between them, and inside it the medals caught light like they'd been waiting 20 years to be seen. True class is what you do when the lights go out, she thought. But also when they come back on. Subscribe for more stories of heroes you've never heard of, people like Laura Bennett who saved lives in the darkness and then spent years trying to disappear. Like, comment, and let us know, what would you do if the one thing you were running from finally caught up with you?